Rain drummed against the windshield in a steady rhythm that Dennis Webb had long stopped noticing. The wipers moved back and forth, clearing water in predictable arcs while he guided the empty city bus through Portland's sleeping streets. His shift always ended like this, alone with the hum of the engine and whatever old rock station managed to cut through the static at 2 a.m. Tonight it was playing something from the 80s, a song about dreams and highways that felt appropriate for the strange quiet that settled over cities in the deepest hours. Dennis had been driving this route for 8 years. He knew every pothole, every traffic light that stayed red too long, every corner where the bus leaned a little harder than it should. At 43, he had the kind of face that people forgot easily, which suited him fine. Average height, brown hair going gray at the temples, hands calloused from years of gripping a steering wheel. His daughter Becky said he had kind eyes, but Dennis figured she was biased because he was her dad. The bus rumbled past shuttered storefronts and apartment buildings where normal people slept normal lives. Dennis checked his watch. 20 minutes until he could park this beast and head home. Maybe he would have time to wrap Becky's birthday present before catching a few hours of sleep. She was turning 12 next week, growing up faster than he could track. The dinosaur toys she used to love sat forgotten in boxes now, replaced by books about space and drawings of creatures that existed only in her imagination. Was thinking about whether 12 was too old for the telescope. He had saved up for when the air inside the bus suddenly felt wrong, not cold exactly but charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The hair on Dennis's arm stood up. He glanced in the wide rearview mirror out of habit, expecting to see the same empty seats he had been looking at for the past hour. 3 small shapes huddled in the seat directly behind him. Dennis's foot slammed on the brake. The bus lurched hard enough to throw him against the steering wheel. His heart hammered in his chest as he twisted around in his seat, one hand already reaching for the radio to call dispatch. The words died in his throat. They were not human. That much was immediately impossibly clear. Each creature was roughly the size of a large cat, covered in scales that seemed to shift colors in the dim bus lighting. One shimmered with bronze tones, another appeared almost silver white, and the third had dark gray scales with pronounced ridges running down its spine. They had wings, delicate and translucent, folded tight against their small bodies. Their eyes glowed faintly like distant stars, and those eyes were fixed on Dennis with an expression he recognized despite the alien features. Fear. Pure, simple fear. The bronze one made a sound, a chirp that reminded Dennis of birds, but with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in his chest. The other two pressed closer together, trembling. Dennis realized his hand was still hovering over the radio. He should call someone. The police. The military. Someone who knew what to do when impossible things appeared on your bus in the middle of the night. But he did not make the call. Instead, Dennis looked at 3 small creatures who were clearly terrified, and saw his daughter Becky at age 5, when she had gotten separated from him at the fair. That same look of being lost and scared in a world suddenly too big and strange. The rational part of his brain screamed that this was different, that these were not children, not even human. The rest of him, the part that had raised a daughter alone for 12 years, saw babies in trouble. Dennis slowly lowered his hand from the radio. He took a breath, then another, trying to calm the adrenaline spike making his hands shake. The bronze creature took a tentative step forward, still on the seat but closer now. Dennis could see details he had missed in his first shock. Small burns marked the edges of those delicate wings. The silver one had a cut along its shoulder that looked painful. They were hurt. Okay, Dennis said softly, more to himself than to them. Okay, just stay calm. I'm not going to hurt you. The bronze creature tilted its head, and Dennis could have sworn it understood the tone if not the words. He carefully stood from the driver's seat, moving slow and deliberate. The bus sat empty on a street with no other traffic, rain continuing its steady percussion on the roof. Dennis edged into the aisle, giving them space. Up close, he could see them shivering despite the warmth of the bus heater. You're cold, Dennis observed, speaking in the same gentle voice he had used when Becky was small and woke from nightmares. And you're hurt. Where did you come from? The bronze one extended a small claw, not threatening, just reaching. Dennis stood very still and let it touch his hand. The scales felt warm and surprisingly soft, like leather worn smooth with age. The moment of contact sent a strange tingle through his arm, and for just a second Dennis saw something. Not words or clear images, just impressions, darkness, falling, panic, separation. They were lost. Somehow, impossibly, these creatures were lost and scared and had nowhere else to go. Dennis made a decision that his rational brain knew was crazy. He pulled out his phone and called his supervisor, putting enough rasp in his voice to sell the lie. Food poisoning. Needed to end the route early, sorry for the inconvenience. The supervisor, half asleep and not paid enough to care, told him to park the bus at the depot and get some rest. Instead, Dennis Webb sat back down in the driver's seat, checked his mirrors, and pulled the bus back onto the empty street. But instead of heading to the depot, he turned toward home. 3 small dragons remained huddled in the seat behind him, their glowing eyes watching his every move. "I don't know what you are," Dennis said quietly as he drove through the rain, "but I know scared kids when I see them. We'll figure out the rest later." The bronze one chirped again, softer this time, and Dennis chose to believe it was something like gratitude. He drove through the sleeping city with impossible passengers, and tried not to think about how completely his life had just changed in the space of a single heartbeat. The house was dark when Dennis pulled into the driveway, which meant Becky was still asleep upstairs like she should be on a school night. He sat in the parked bus for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to figure out exactly how he had gotten himself into this situation. 3 alien creatures sat behind him, occasionally making soft chirping sounds to each other. They had not tried to hurt him during the drive. Mostly, they just huddled together and watched the city pass by with those unsettling, glowing eyes. Dennis knew he could not keep a bus parked in his driveway forever. Tomorrow there would be questions, consequences, probably the end of his career. But that was tomorrow's problem. Right now he had 3 injured creatures who needed somewhere safe and warm, and his basement workshop was the only place he could think of that Becky would not stumble into before school. Getting them inside proved easier than expected. The moment Dennis opened the bus door, the bronze one seemed to understand they were meant to follow. It hopped down the steps with surprising grace despite its injured wings, and the other 2 scrambled after it. They moved on all 4s like cats, their wings folded tight, staying close to Dennis's legs as he led them around the side of the house to the basement entrance. The workshop smelled like sawdust and motor oil, familiar and comforting. Dennis flicked on the lights and watched the 3 creatures scatter briefly before regrouping near his workbench. He found himself moving on autopilot, grabbing the space heater from the corner and setting it up near his old recliner. He pulled down blankets from the storage shelf, the thick camping ones he had not used since that trip to the coast 3 years ago. The creatures watched every movement with intelligent eyes that made him increasingly uncomfortable with calling them mere animals. "Okay," Dennis said, spreading the blankets near the heater. "You need to warm up. And probably eat something, though I have no idea what." He headed back upstairs, moving quietly through the kitchen. What did alien dragon things eat? Meat seemed like a safe bet given the teeth he had glimpsed, but he was not about to feed them raw hamburger without knowing more. He grabbed water bottles, some leftover chicken from dinner, a banana because why not, and a sleeve of crackers. Becky's old picture books caught his eye as he passed the living room, and on impulse he grabbed one of those too. Back in the basement, Dennis found all 3 creatures huddled in the blankets, soaking up the warmth from the heater. They perked up when he returned, especially when he set down the plate of chicken. The bronze one approached first, always the brave one, and sniffed carefully before taking a piece. The others followed suit. They ate with surprising delicacy, not the frenzied feeding he might have expected. Dennis settled into his workbench chair and just watched them for a while. The adrenaline was finally fading, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and the growing realization of how insane this situation was. He had kidnapped 3 alien life forms. That was technically what he had done, even if his intentions were good. Governments went to war over less than this. The bronze creature finished eating and moved toward Dennis, still cautious but growing bolder. It looked at the picture book he had set down, then back at Dennis. Without really thinking about why, Dennis opened the book. It was one of those simple board books Becky had loved as a toddler, each page showing a different animal with its name underneath. Dog, cat, bird, horse. The bronze one placed a small claw on the page showing the bird. The moment it made contact, Dennis's world tilted sideways. Images flooded his mind, not quite like seeing and not quite like remembering. A massive ship, sleek and beautiful, filled with beings like the creatures in his basement but much larger. a sense of safety and routine. Then chaos, alarms screaming in tones that needed no translation, fire and smoke and desperate movement. A larger version of the bronze creature, this one scarred and fierce, pushing the three small ones into a pod. A desperate goodbye, the pod launching, spinning, systems failing, impact. Darkness. Dennis jerked back, gasping. The bronze creature withdrew its claw from the book and the connection broke. Dennis's heart raced again, but not from fear this time. Understanding. "You're trying to tell me what happened," he said slowly. "You're trying to communicate." The creature chirped, and Dennis chose to interpret that as agreement. He looked at all three of them with new eyes. They were not just lost. They had been separated from someone who loved them, hidden away to keep them safe when something went terribly wrong. The burns on their wings, the cuts and bruises, they had crashed here, and whoever had protected them had no idea where they were, or if they had even survived. Dennis thought about Becky sleeping upstairs, safe in her bed. He thought about what he would do, how far he would go if she was lost somewhere and he had no way to find her. The answer was simple. He would tear the world apart. These creatures had someone out there searching for them, someone who had saved them during an attack, who had sent them away to protect them, and they had ended up cold and hurt and alone on a random bus in Portland because their escape pod had malfunctioned. "Your family is looking for you," Dennis said softly. "Someone out there is trying to find you." The bronze one moved closer and pressed against Dennis's leg. He could feel it trembling, and realized this brave little creature had been holding itself together through sheer will. Now in this warm basement with food in its belly and a strange being speaking in gentle tones, it was finally letting itself feel the fear and loss. Dennis reached down slowly and placed his hand on the creature's head. Between the small horns he had not noticed before. The scales were warm under his palm. He stroked gently, the way he used to comfort Becky after bad dreams, and felt the trembling gradually ease. "I don't know how yet," Dennis promised, "but I'm going to help you get home. That's what we're going to do. We're going to find your family." The silver one and the ridged one crept closer, drawn by the comfort being offered. Soon all three were pressed against Dennis, seeking warmth and safety from the only friendly being they had found on this strange world. He sat on the cold basement floor, one hand on each of the three impossible creatures, and made a promise he had no idea how to keep. Upstairs, Becky's alarm would go off in 4 hours. She would come looking for her father to make breakfast, and Dennis would have to explain why there were 3 baby dragons sleeping in their basement, but that was 4 hours away. For now, he just sat with 3 lost children who happened to have scales and wings, and let them know they were not alone anymore. Dennis woke to someone shaking his shoulder and the smell of something burning. He jerked upright in the recliner, his neck protesting the awkward angle he had slept in, and found his daughter Becky standing over him with wide eyes. The 3 dragons were pressed into the corner near the workbench, wings flared defensively, and a small scorch mark marred the concrete floor where the ridged one had apparently breathed fire in panic. "Dad," Becky said in the carefully controlled voice she used when trying very hard not to scream, "why are there dragons in our basement?" Dennis ran a hand over his face, buying himself a few seconds to think. He had planned to tell her gently over breakfast with time to explain properly. Instead, she had clearly come looking for him before school and found a scene that would give most 12-year-olds nightmares. But Becky was not screaming or running. She was standing her ground, waiting for an explanation, and Dennis felt a surge of pride even through his exhaustion. "It's a long story," he started, but Becky cut him off. "Are they hurt? That one's wing looks burned." She pointed at the bronze dragon, her fear already shifting into concern. That was his daughter, always more worried about others than herself. The next hour passed in a strange blur. Dennis explained everything while Becky knelt near the dragons, speaking softly to them the way she talked to frightened animals at the shelter where she volunteered. The creatures seemed to sense she meant no harm. The bronze one approached her first naturally, and within minutes all 3 were letting her examine their injuries with surprising trust. "We need bandages," Becky announced, "and probably antibiotics, but I don't know if human medicine works on them. Do you think hydrogen peroxide would hurt their scales?" Dennis found himself following his daughter's instructions as she turned his workshop into a makeshift clinic. She had always been good with animals, calm and gentle and unafraid. Apparently that extended to alien life forms. While Dennis gathered first aid supplies, Becky kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation with the dragons, telling them they were safe now, that everything would be okay. The bronze one let Becky clean the burns on its wing without protest. The silver one, the smallest, climbed right into her lap. The ridged one took longer to trust, but even it eventually allowed her to treat the cut along its shoulder. Dennis watched his daughter work and wondered when exactly she had grown up enough to handle a crisis better than he could. "We need to name them properly," Becky said as she wrapped gauze around the silver one's foreleg. "We can't just keep calling them by their colors. Becky, they probably have their own names." "Sure, but we don't know what they are. So until we figure out how to ask, they need something to answer to." She looked at each dragon in turn, her face serious with concentration. "This one should be Copper," she decided, pointing at the bronze dragon. "And this little guy is Frost." The silver one chirped at its new name. "And the big scary one can be Ridge because of the spikes." Dennis wanted to argue that naming them would make everything harder when it came time to return them to their family. But he could see the dragons responding to Becky's voice, to the confidence in her tone. Maybe having names would help them feel less lost. As if summoning his fears by thinking about them, the television upstairs suddenly blared with an emergency broadcast tone. Dennis and Becky exchanged glances before racing up the stairs, the dragons scrambling after them. The news showed shaky footage of something crashing near the moon. Military jets scrambling, talking heads speculating about meteors and space debris. "That's not a meteor," Becky said quietly. "That's their ship, isn't it?" Dennis nodded, his stomach sinking. The news showed military convoys heading toward the Columbia River Gorge, where debris had been recovered. They were showing pictures now, zoomed in and grainy, but clear enough to see crystalline structures that were definitely not natural. The government was calling it a foreign satellite. Nobody was saying aliens yet, but Dennis could read between the lines. "Dad, if the military finds their escape pod, they'll know the dragons are here." "Maybe." Dennis chewed his lip, thinking hard. "Or maybe they'll think whatever was in the pod died on impact. We need to keep Copper and the others hidden until we figure out our next move." The bronze dragon, Copper, pressed against Dennis's leg and made a sound that was almost like a question. Those mental images came again when Dennis touched the creature's head, stronger now that the connection had been established. He saw the escape pod still intact somewhere in the forest, and inside it something important, a device, a beacon. "There's something in their pod," Dennis said slowly, trying to parse the alien thoughts. "Something they need. A way to signal for help, maybe." Becky's eyes lit up with understanding and worry in equal measure. "So we have to get to the crash site before the military locks it down completely." "Absolutely not." "That's way too dangerous. Dad, how else are they getting home? We can't keep 3 dragons in the basement forever." "They're already growing." Becky pointed at Copper, who did seem slightly larger than last night. "Someone needs to activate that beacon or signal or whatever it is. And it has to be us because we're the only ones who know they're alive and need help." Dennis wanted to argue, to find a safer solution that did not involve sneaking into a military-controlled area with his 12-year-old daughter. But as he looked at the 3 dragons watching him with trusting eyes, and at Becky's determined face, he realized she was right. Nobody else was going to help these creatures get home. Nobody else even knew they needed help. "We need more information first," Dennis said carefully. "We need to know exactly where the pod is, what security is there, and how we could possibly get close enough to activate this beacon without getting arrested or shot." "Pete could help," Becky suggested. "He was in the military. He knows about security and stuff." Dennis thought about his friend Pete, who ran the garage where Dennis got his car serviced. Ex-Marine, divorced. Too many opinions about everything but loyal to a fault. It was insane to bring another person into this mess. It was also probably their only chance. "Call in sick to school," Dennis told Becky. "Tell them you have the same food poisoning I supposedly had. We're going to visit Pete." Downstairs, something crashed. They ran back to find Ridge had knocked over a lamp while trying to stretch its wings. The creature looked embarrassed, if that was possible for a dragon. Copper and Frost were attempting to clean up the broken glass with their small claws, which was only making things worse. "New rule," Becky announced. "No flying in the basement." The dragons chirped in what sounded like agreement, and Dennis had the strangest thought that this was his life now. Making house rules for aliens, planning military infiltrations with his daughter, trying to return lost children to a family somewhere among the stars. His boring, predictable life driving the night bus had ended the moment 3 impossible passengers appeared in his rearview mirror. And despite the fear and uncertainty, Despite knowing he was probably going to end up in federal prison for this, Dennis discovered something surprising. He did not want his old life back. Not even a little bit. Pete's garage sat at the end of a gravel road that most people drove past without noticing, which was exactly how Pete liked it. Dennis pulled up in his old sedan with Becky in the passenger seat and 3 dragons hidden under blankets in the back. Through the open bay door, he could see Pete's legs sticking out from under a pickup truck, classic rock blaring from speakers held together with duct tape. "Stay here," Dennis told Becky. "Let me talk to him first." But before Dennis could even get out, Pete rolled out from under the truck, took one look at the car, and frowned. Pete was built like a tank, all shoulders and suspicion, with the kind of face that looked like it had lost arguments with several fists over the years. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, clearly ready to tell Dennis that he could not work on the car today. Then Copper poked his head up from the blanket. To Pete's credit, he did not shout or run or reach for a weapon. He just froze, went very pale, and stared at the bronze dragon now fully visible in the back seat. Frost and Ridge emerged too, curious about their surroundings, and Pete made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a prayer. "Dennis," Pete said carefully, "is that what I think it is?" "Depends on what you think it is. I think it's 3 alien dragons in your back seat, which means I've either had a stroke or the world got a lot more interesting than it was yesterday." Dennis quickly explained everything while Pete listened with the intense focus he probably used in the Marines when receiving mission briefings. The dragons seemed to sense Pete was being evaluated, because they stayed quiet and remarkably well behaved. When Dennis finished, Pete was quiet for a long moment, staring at Copper with an unreadable expression. "You're planning something stupid," Pete finally said. "That's why you're here. You need help with something stupid. There's a beacon in the crash site. The military has the area locked down. We need to get in, activate it, and get out. That's not stupid. That's suicidal." Pete looked at Becky, who had joined them despite Dennis's instructions to wait. "And you're bringing your kid?" "I'm coming whether he lets me or not," Becky said firmly. "They're my friends too." Pete laughed, a sharp bark of sound with no humor in it. "Your friends? Kid, those are extraterrestrial biological entities that probably have half the alphabet agencies looking for them. This isn't finding a lost puppy." "No," Becky agreed. "It's better. Puppies can't show you their memories or breathe fire or understand when you're sad. These guys are smart. They're people, just different people, and they need our help getting home." Something in Pete's expression shifted. He crouched down to eye level with the dragons, studying them the way he studied engines, looking for the truth under the surface. Copper approached him slowly, and Pete held very still as the dragon sniffed his outstretched hand. After a moment, Copper made a soft chirping sound and bumped his head against Pete's palm. "Well, damn," Pete muttered. Okay, this is happening. Show me the news footage again." They spent the next 2 hours in Pete's office, a cluttered room that smelled like coffee and gun oil. Pete pulled up satellite images on his ancient computer, cross-referenced news reports, and started sketching diagrams on the back of old invoices. The dragons settled on the couch, watching everything with their glowing eyes. Frost fell asleep in Becky's lap. Ridge discovered Pete's stress ball and became fascinated with squeezing it. "Here's the situation," Pete said, pointing at his rough map. "They've got the crash site cordoned off about 10 miles into the gorge. 2 access roads, both blocked. They're running regular patrols, probably 4-hour rotations. Weather forecast shows a storm rolling in tonight. Heavy rain, low visibility." "So we go tonight," Dennis said. "We go tonight," Pete agreed, "but we're not getting in by road. There's a hiking trail that comes within half a mile of the site. Not easy terrain, especially in the dark and rain, but it's our best shot. We hike in, locate the pod, let the little guys do their thing with the beacon, and hike out before anyone knows we were there." "And if we get caught?" Becky asked. Pete met her eyes without flinching. "Then you say your dad forced you to come along. You're 12, you're a victim. Make them believe it. Dennis and I will take the fall. No way. We're all in this together." "Becky," Dennis started, but Pete cut him off. "She's right. We're all in, or we're not doing this at all. I learned that in the Marines. You don't split the team, you don't leave anyone behind, and you sure as hell don't lie to each other about the stakes." He looked at each of them in turn, including the dragons. This could go very wrong. We could end up in federal prison. We could get shot by some nervous private who thinks we're terrorists. Everyone needs to understand that before we commit. Copper made a sound, not quite a chirp, but something deeper, more resonant. The mental connection Dennis had been experiencing suddenly expanded, and somehow Pete and Becky were part of it too. Images flowed between them, not words, but pure meaning. The dragon showing them what it meant to be lost, to be separated from family, to be small and scared in a vast, uncaring universe. And then showing them what Dennis's kindness had meant, how it felt to be seen and protected by someone who had no reason to help, except that it was the right thing to do. The connection broke, leaving all three humans blinking back tears they did not quite understand. "Well," Pete said roughly, clearing his throat, "I guess we're doing this then." They spent the afternoon preparing. Pete pulled out old military gear from storage, waterproof packs, and thermal blankets. Becky modified backpacks to carry the dragons, cutting holes for their wings and adding padding. The dragons seemed to understand something important was happening. They stayed close, sometimes touching hands or legs, sharing those mental impressions that were becoming easier to interpret. As the sun began to set, dark clouds rolled in exactly as forecasted. Dennis loaded the car while Pete triple-checked their supplies. Becky sat with the three dragons, telling them it would be okay, that they were going home soon. Copper nuzzled her face, and Dennis heard his daughter whisper a promise that she would not let anything happen to them. "You ready for this?" Pete asked Dennis quietly. "No," Dennis admitted, "but I don't think that matters anymore." "It never does. The important stuff, you're never really ready. You just do it anyway because the alternative is worse." Pete clapped him on the shoulder. "For what it's worth, this is the right thing. Stupid, dangerous, probably illegal, but right." They drove out of the city as night fell and the storm began in earnest. Rain lashed the windshield hard enough to overwhelm the wipers. The dragons were quiet in their modified backpacks, trusting completely that the strange humans taking them into the darkness knew what they were doing. Dennis wished he had that much faith. All he had was the knowledge that three small creatures needed help, and nobody else was going to provide it. Sometimes that had to be enough. Sometimes being human meant doing the scary thing simply because it needed doing. The gorge loomed ahead, dark and forbidding, full of military personnel and unknown dangers. Somewhere in that darkness was a beacon that could call across the stars. All they had to do was survive long enough to activate it. "Here we go," Pete said as they turned onto the access road that would take them to the hiking trail. Last chance to back out. Nobody said a word. They drove on into the storm. The hiking trail turned into mud within the first 20 minutes, sucking at their boots with every step. Rain came down in sheets so thick Dennis could barely see Pete's back ahead of him, and Becky's hand gripped his tightly as they navigated roots and rocks made treacherous by the storm. The dragons remained silent in their backpacks, occasionally shifting their weight but otherwise trusting completely in the humans carrying them through the darkness. Pete led them deeper into the forest using a compass and a map he had memorized, refusing to risk the light from his phone. Dennis's legs burned from the climb. His jacket was soaked through despite being supposedly waterproof, and every sound made him flinch with the expectation of being discovered. But they kept moving, because turning back now meant leaving Copper and the others stranded on Earth forever. After what felt like hours but was probably 40 minutes, Pete held up a fist and they stopped. Ahead, through the trees, lights cut through the rain. The crash site. Pete pulled them into a huddle behind a fallen log, and they crouched in the mud while he scanned the area through binoculars. 4 guards visible, Pete whispered. "Probably more in the tents. The pod is right there, see it? Looks like they've got some kind of testing equipment set up, but nobody's actively working on it in this weather. They're all huddled by the generators staying warm." Dennis could just make out the shape of something that definitely was not from Earth, a crystalline structure that seemed to glow faintly, even in the darkness. Copper stirred in his backpack, making an urgent sound. The dragon knew they were close to the beacon, close to the chance of going home. "How do we get to it without being seen?" Becky asked. Pete grimaced. "We don't, not all of us. The dragons need to be the ones to activate it, right? So here's what we do. I create a distraction on the east side, draw the guards away. You two take the dragons to the pod, do whatever needs doing, and then we all meet back at the car. Simple." "That's not simple. That's you getting arrested while we escape," Dennis objected. "Yeah, probably. But I'm old, I'm single, and I already served my country once. You've got a kid who needs her dad. So this is how it goes." Pete's voice left no room for argument. Soon as you hear me start making noise, you move fast and quiet. Get to the pod, activate the beacon, get out. Don't wait for me. Before Dennis could protest further, Pete was gone, vanishing into the rain-soaked darkness like a ghost. Dennis looked at Becky, saw his own fear reflected in her eyes, and knew they had seconds to prepare. He helped her pull the dragons from the backpacks. Copper, Frost, and Ridge shook themselves, wings flaring briefly before folding tight against the rain. Stay close, Dennis whispered to the dragons. We're going to move fast when Pete gives us the signal. They did not have to wait long. An explosion of sound erupted from the eastern edge of the perimeter, someone shouting an alarm, the roar of an engine. Pete had hot-wired one of the military vehicles and was driving it away from the site with the horn blaring. Guards scrambled, shouting into radios, running toward the commotion. Now, Dennis hissed. They ran through the mud, Becky stumbling but catching herself, the dragons racing alongside them with surprising speed. The pod loomed larger, beautiful and alien, covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things. No guards remained nearby. Everyone had responded to Pete's distraction. Copper reached the pod first and pressed both small claws against its surface. The crystalline structure responded immediately, panels sliding open to reveal an interior that glowed with soft light. Inside was a device about the size of a shoebox, covered in symbols that hurt Dennis's eyes to look at directly. Frost and Ridge moved to join Copper, all three dragons touching the device at once. The beacon activated with a sound that was not quite sound, more like a feeling that resonated in Dennis's chest. Light poured from the pod, not the harsh white of human technology, but something warmer, alive, pulsing with rhythms that felt like a heartbeat. The dragons' eyes blazed brightly as they channeled something through their small bodies, the beacon responding to their presence in ways Dennis did not understand. Contact. We have unauthorized personnel at the pod. The shout came from their right. A guard had broken away from the distraction, had seen them. He was running toward them, weapon drawn, yelling for backup. Becky, take the dragons and run. Dennis moved to intercept the guard, knowing he had no chance but buying his daughter precious seconds to escape. But Becky did not run. She stood her ground next to the dragons who had not finished with the beacon. It's not done yet. Dad, they need more time. More guards were coming now, converging on their position. Dennis put himself between them and his daughter, raising his hands in a gesture that was either surrender or protection. The lead guard reached them, weapon pointed at Dennis's chest, shouting orders to get on the ground. These are children. Dennis heard himself yelling back. They're just children trying to get home. We're not terrorists. We're not stealing anything. We're helping them signal their family. Get away from the artifact, now! The beacon's pulse grew stronger, light expanding outward in waves. Ridge let out a sound that was part chirp and part something much larger, much older. The frequency of it made the guard stumble, made Dennis's teeth ache. And then the sky tore open. Colors that had no names spilled across the clouds, a wound in reality itself. The guards stopped, weapons lowering despite their training, because what descended from that impossible tear was beyond anything human weapons could affect. A ship, massive and graceful, covered in the same living crystalline patterns as the pod. It was not built, Dennis realized with awe. It was grown. It was alive in some fundamental way that human ships were not. The ship settled over the clearing, impossibly large and yet silent except for the same pulse rhythm as the beacon. A section of its hull opened and something emerged. Someone emerged, a dragon but fully grown, easily 20 feet long with scales like burnished copper marked with scars from recent battle. Its eyes blazed with intelligence and desperate hope as it saw the three small dragons still pressed against the beacon. Copper's cry could have shattered glass. The three young dragons launched themselves from the pod, wings pumping frantically despite their injuries, racing toward the massive being descending from the ship. The adult dragon caught them mid-air with a gentleness that contradicted its fearsome appearance, gathering all three against its chest with sounds that needed no translation. Grief, relief, joy, love. The clearing had gone completely silent. Every human present watched the reunion with something like awe. The adult dragon held the young ones for a long moment, then turned its blazing gaze on Dennis. It approached slowly, still cradling the young dragons, and lowered its massive head until it was level with Dennis's face. The mental connection, when it came, was overwhelming. Gratitude deeper than any words could express. the knowledge of searching desperately, following every possible trajectory, fearing the worst, the understanding of what Dennis had risked, what he had done simply because it was right. The adult dragon's name translated in Dennis's mind as something like Guardian Ashir, and Ashir recognized that Dennis was not so different. Another guardian, another protector of the vulnerable. Copper wriggled free from Ashir's grasp and flew to Dennis, pressing his small head against Dennis's chest one last time. The mental images that came were simple and clear. "Thank you, friend, family, remember." "I'll remember," Dennis whispered, tears mixing with rain on his face. "I promise I'll remember." Military vehicles were arriving now. More guards pouring into the clearing, someone with a lot of authority shouting orders. But Dennis could barely hear them. He watched Copper return to Ashir's protective embrace. Watched all three young dragons look back at him and Becky one last time. Then they were rising toward the ship, toward home and safety and family. The ship began to ascend, that impossible tear in the sky widening to accept it. But before it vanished completely, something small detached and fell, landing softly in Dennis's outstretched hands. A device smooth and warm, covered in symbols he could not read but somehow understood. A way to communicate, a promise that this was not goodbye forever. Then the ship was gone, the tear sealed, and the storm suddenly felt like just a storm again. Dennis stood in the mud holding an alien communication device surrounded by military personnel with weapons drawn. He looked at Becky, who was crying and smiling at the same time. He thought about Pete, probably already in custody. He thought about how completely his normal life had ended, and he would not change a single moment of it. The interrogation room was exactly like the ones in movies. All gray walls and uncomfortable chairs and a mirror that was obviously one-way glass. Dennis had been sitting there for 6 hours, answering the same questions over and over while his daughter was somewhere else in the building going through her own questioning. They had separated him from Becky immediately, which was the only thing that truly scared him. Everything else, the weapons, the threats, the stern men and women in suits demanding answers that he could handle. But not knowing if his daughter was okay made his hands shake every time he thought about it. Colonel Patricia Morris sat across from him, her face carved from stone and exhaustion. She had been the one asking most of the questions, circling around the same basic themes. How long had he harbored the extraterrestrial entities? Who else knew? What did he think he was accomplishing by interfering with a government operation? "Let me tell you what I think happened," Colonel Morris said, her voice worn down from hours of talking. "I think you found 3 injured alien life forms, and instead of contacting proper authorities, you decided to play hero. You involved your 12-year-old daughter in an incredibly dangerous situation. You enlisted a civilian with military training to help you breach a secure military site. And in doing so, you made contact with an alien species without any diplomatic preparation, potentially putting the entire planet at risk." Dennis met her eyes steadily. "I protected 3 scared children until I could help them get home. That's what happened. They're not children, Mr. Webb. They're unknown biological entities from an unknown civilization with unknown intentions. Did they look unknown to you?" Dennis leaned forward. "Because I was there. I saw that reunion. That was a parent who thought their kids were dead finding out they were alive. That's not unknown. That's universal." Something flickered in Colonel Morris's expression, there and gone so fast Dennis almost missed it. She was a mother too, he realized. She understood exactly what he was talking about, even if she could not admit it. "The device they gave you," she said, changing tactics. "Where is it?" "Safe. And it stays safe until I know my daughter is okay and Pete is being treated fairly." "You're not in a position to make demands. Neither are you. That device is the only way Earth has to communicate with the Dravik. And I'm guessing your bosses really want to be able to do that. So yes, Colonel, I think I am in a position to make some demands." They stared at each other across the table, 2 people at the end of their patience. Finally, Colonel Morris stood. "Wait here." She was gone for 20 minutes. When she returned, Becky was with her. Dennis was out of his chair instantly, checking his daughter over for any sign of harm. Becky looked exhausted and rumpled but unharmed, and she threw her arms around him with enough force to nearly knock him over. "I'm okay, Dad." They were actually pretty nice. One of the interviewers had a daughter my age. She gave me hot chocolate. Dennis held her tight and looked at Colonel Morris over her head, asking silent questions. "Your friend Pete is in medical getting checked out. Some bruises from the tackle when we caught him, nothing serious. He's being charged with multiple violations, but... She held up a hand as Dennis started to protest. There are people above my pay grade having discussions about how exactly this situation should be handled. Public opinion matters, Mr. Webb, and the footage from our security cameras shows very clearly what happened in that clearing. What does that mean? It means the world watched you protect 3 alien children, watched a reunion between a parent and offspring, and watched a civilian accomplish first contact without any violence or hostility. Congress is getting calls. The president is getting calls. Nobody wants to see you become a martyr for doing what a lot of people think was the right thing. Colonel Morris pulled out a chair and sat heavily. She suddenly looked every year of her age and then some. I'm a soldier. I follow orders. But I'm also a mother. And if my daughter was lost somewhere and someone helped her get home, I would want to thank them, not arrest them. So we're going to make a deal, Mr. Webb. The deal was simple. Dennis would cooperate fully with a diplomatic and scientific team being assembled to study the Dravik device and establish communication protocols. He would not speak to the press without clearance. He would essentially become a civilian consultant on humanity's first contact situation. In exchange, all charges would be dropped for him, Becky, and Pete. They would be allowed to go home. And Dennis would retain possession of the communication device, since it seemed to be keyed to him specifically anyway. Why? Dennis asked. Why not just take the device and lock me up? Because the Dravik chose you. They trusted you with their children and then gave you the means to contact them again. That means something. Maybe it means everything. Colonel Morris stood and offered her hand. Welcome to the most important job in human history, Mr. Webb. Try not to screw it up. 3 weeks later, Dennis sat in his backyard with the communication device in his hands. Becky was inside doing homework. Pete was back at his garage after being thoroughly debriefed, and life had almost returned to something resembling normal. Except for the scientists who called daily, the security detail watching his house, and the alien device that hummed softly against his palms. He activated it the way Copper had shown him through their mental link, a specific pattern of touches. The device warmed and images began to flow, not words but pure meaning, the way the dragons communicated. He saw Copper, Frost, and Ridge in a place of warmth and safety, surrounded by others of their kind. He saw them healing, playing, learning. He saw them with Guardian Ashir, who watched over them with fierce devotion. Then the images shifted and he saw himself. The way Copper remembered him. Not as a human or an alien or anything so simple, just as someone who helped when it mattered, someone who saw children in need and acted without hesitation. The feelings that came with the image were complex, but one strand rang clear above all others. Family. Dennis was family now, across species and stars and every difference that should have made connection impossible. He sent his own message back, focusing on what he wanted the dragons to know, that he thought of them often, that he hoped they were happy and safe, that Earth was learning and growing and maybe someday would be ready to meet their people properly, that he missed them. The device pulsed with acknowledgement. Copper understood. They all understood, Dad? Becky came out with 2 mugs of tea settling beside him on the porch steps. Did you hear back from them? Yeah, they're doing well. Growing fast, apparently. Ashir sends gratitude. Are they coming back? Dennis considered the question. The device could do more than send messages. It could send coordinates, issue invitations. The Dravik were out there somewhere, traveling the galaxy, and humanity now had a direct line to them. The implications were staggering. Eventually, Dennis said, when we're ready. When they're ready. But yes, I think they'll come back. Copper promised. Becky leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together watching the stars begin to appear as the sun set. Somewhere up there, 3 young dragons were learning what it meant to be Dravik, learning their history, their culture, their place in a vast galactic community. And sometimes, in quiet moments, they thought about a bus driver and his daughter, who had shown them that kindness existed everywhere, even on strange worlds, from strange beings. Dennis's phone rang. The special one the government had given him, the one that only a few people had the number to. He answered it. Mr. Webb, this is Dr. Sarah Rodriguez from the First Contact Initiative. We've been analyzing the linguistic patterns in the Dravik communication, and we could really use your input. Would you be available for a consultation tomorrow? I drive a bus, Doctor. I'm not qualified to consult on alien languages. With respect, Mr. Webb, You're the only human who has successfully communicated with the Dravik. That makes you uniquely qualified. We need your help." Dennis looked at his daughter, who was watching him with eyes that said she already knew what his answer would be. He thought about Copper pressing a small head against his chest. He thought about Ashir's gratitude. He thought about bridges built between worlds with nothing but compassion and courage. "I'll be there," Dennis said. "What time?" After he hung up, Becky smiled at him. "You know this is going to be your whole life now, right? You're not just a bus driver anymore." "Sure I am. I just drive a different route now, one that goes a bit farther than downtown Portland." "Dad, that was terrible." "Yeah, but you smiled." They sat together as full darkness fell and the stars blazed overhead. Dennis held the communication device and felt its gentle pulse, a heartbeat from across the galaxy. 3 baby dragons were home safe because one bus driver had chosen to see children instead of aliens, to act with compassion instead of fear, to risk everything for beings he had no reason to help except that they needed help. In the grand scope of human history, Dennis Webb would be remembered as the man who made first contact possible, but in his own heart, he was just a father who understood that some children have scales and wings, and that made them no less deserving of protection. The device pulsed again, and Dennis sent back the simplest message he could form. "Good night, little ones. Sleep well. We'll talk again tomorrow." The stars had never looked more beautiful or more full of possibility. Humanity's story had just expanded to include the whole galaxy, and it had started in the most human way possible, with kindness, with a choice to help, with love that needed no translation. Dennis Webb drove a bus, but now he also drove something far more important. He drove hope for what humanity could become when it chose to be its best self. And somewhere among those distant stars, 3 young dragons remembered the strange being who had shown them that family was not about species or biology. It was about who showed up when you needed them most. The end.